I knew the HOA was going to be a problem the moment I saw her Margene. Mid-50s, platinum bob that looked like it hadn't moved since 1985, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like it was a holy relic. She introduced herself as the acting president of the Heritage Hills Homeowners Association, and without blinking, asked if I'd be willing to tear down that eyesore of a barn. I had just moved in 3 weeks ago. My name's Vaughn Nettle, and that barn, it was my late grandfather's. Solid oak, built with his own hands in 1962. Yeah, it needed a little work, but it wasn't going anywhere, not if I had breath in my body. That barn's staying. It's on my property and it's structurally sound, I told her. Margene sniffed like I just offered her a glass of milk past its expiration. The HOA covenants specify all outbuildings must conform to neighborhood aesthetics. Aesthetics, I said, raising an eyebrow. Half the houses here have plastic flamingos on the lawn. She didn't laugh. The next week, I came home from my shift at the fire station to find yellow tape strung across my driveway and a neon pink paper slapped on my barn door. Notice of demolition. I ripped it down and marched over to Margene's house. She opened the door like she expected me. "You can't just order a demolition of something you don't own," I said, holding the notice in her face. "Oh, but I can," she said, smug as ever. "The HOA board voted, you never submitted a renovation plan. That barn is non-compliant. I don't need your permission to maintain a building that predates this entire subdivision," I shot back. "Well, maybe you should have read the fine print before moving in," she said, then closed the door in my face. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours reading every clause in the HOA's governing documents. Nothing gave them the right to remove a structure without a legal order. She was bluffing, or so I thought. 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines. I ran outside barefoot and saw a flatbed hauling in a bulldozer. A bulldozer. I sprinted across the lawn, waving my arms like a madman. "Hey, get that thing off my property!" The operator, a kid barely old enough to shave, cut the engine. "The HOA said we had permission," he said, looking genuinely confused. "No, you don't. You step foot on my land with that thing and I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Get it out of here." He backed it out, but the damage was done. My yard was torn up and tire tracks ran 10 feet into the grass beside the barn. I took pictures of everything. Then I called the city. And that's when things got interesting. The city inspector showed up the next morning, clipboard in hand and a deep frown stitched into his face. His name was Lionel Dorsey, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You Vaughn Nettle?" he asked, stepping out of his city-marked pickup. "Yeah," I said, offering my hand. He ignored it. "Got a report yesterday about unauthorized heavy equipment entering private property." "You file that?" I did. "I've got photographic evidence, time-stamped, and a copy of the fake demolition notice, too." He took the papers without a word, flipping through them with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me this wasn't his first dance with an overreaching HOA. "This is enough to open a code enforcement case. If that bulldozer crossed the property line and those tire marks say it did, that's trespassing, destruction of private land, and an attempted unlawful demolition. That's serious." I led him around the side yard to show the full extent of the damage. The deep ruts in the soil, torn grass, and bent irrigation pipe told the story clearly. "I'll need a written statement," Lionel said. "And I'll be contacting the HOA directly. This isn't just a civil matter anymore. If they ordered this without legal authority, we're looking at criminal charges." By the time he left, I was already on my laptop. I wasn't just going to wait for the city to act. I wanted to know exactly who was making these decisions on the board. I pulled up the HOA's public filings and found something interesting. The acting board had only 3 members: Margene, a man named Stuart Riven who ran a landscaping business, and a third, Lori Chen, who worked part-time at the town clerk's office. None of them were elected. There hadn't been a vote in over 2 years. That's a big problem. HOAs are required by state statute to hold annual elections if they serve more than 20 homes. Ours had over 60. I printed out the articles of incorporation and the bylaws I found on the county records site. Then I drove to the county clerk's office and requested a certified copy of the HOA's last filed board election. The clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Yvette, scanned her records for a full 10 minutes before saying, "There's nothing filed since the year before last. That's a violation." I nodded. "Can you provide a certified letter stating that?" She did. I walked out with a copy under my arm. That was the second nail in their coffin. Back home, I started gathering names. I went door to door, talking to neighbors I hadn't even met yet. Everyone had a story. Absurd fines for minor grass height violations, threats for leaving trash cans out an hour too long, even one family who'd been fined $800 for painting their front door, a shade the board didn't like despite no written rule against it. One woman, Mrs. Callahan, showed me a photo of her husband's car with a boot on it. The HOA had claimed it was abandoned. The man drove it to work every day. I kept my voice low. "Did you ever give them permission to enter your driveway for that?" She shook her head. "We were out of town. Came back to find it booted." I added her story to the growing file I was building. By the end of the day, I had 11 affidavits from neighbors and 23 signatures on a petition to demand a full audit and election. The next morning, I took everything to City Hall and filed a formal complaint with the Office of Neighborhood Oversight. They took one look at the stack of documents and called in their legal team. That was when the fire really started. Within 72 hours, a city attorney issued a cease and desist order to the Heritage Hills HOA board. Included was a demand for their financial records for the past 24 months and all documentation of board meetings and decisions. They didn't comply. So the city froze the HOA's bank account. Margene showed up at my door that evening. This time she wasn't smug. Her face was drawn, her eyes rimmed red as if she hadn't slept. "You're ruining this community," she said, her voice strained. "I'm protecting it," I answered. "You tried to destroy a structure on private property without legal grounds. That's not leadership. That's criminal." She stepped forward, but I didn't budge. "You don't understand the position you've put us in," she said. "We were trying to uphold standards." "No," I said. "You were trying to control people, and you broke the law doing it." She didn't reply. She just turned and walked away, her steps heavy. The city's audit took 2 weeks. When it was done, the findings were worse than I imagined, over $28,000 in unaccounted expenditures. 4 falsified fine notices, 2 altered voter records, and 1 invoice from a demolition contractor dated 2 days before the bulldozer showed up at my property. The city filed charges: fraud, abuse of authority, unlawful property damage. The entire board was removed by emergency injunction, and a court-appointed administrator took over HOA operations while a new election was scheduled. The best part? Those fines they loved to dish out. They got a taste of their own medicine. Each board member, including Margene, was hit with a personal fine of $10,000 for malicious misuse of HOA authority. And the HOA itself was ordered to pay restitution to affected homeowners, starting with me. I got a check for the damage to my lawn, plus an additional $5,000 for attempted destruction of private property. The barn still stands. I repainted it myself, deep red with white trim, just like my grandfather had it. Now every Saturday I leave the doors open and let the neighbors drop by. We've turned it into a kind of community hub: barbecues, card games, even a little lending library. The new HOA board, elected fairly, transparent, accountable, and Margene, she moved out 2 months later. The house sold below market value. No one mourned her departure. 3 weeks after the board was dissolved, I got a call from a man named Deputy Marshal Arlen Devins. He said he was part of the county's financial crimes task force and had been looped into the HOA audit findings by the city attorney's office. "I'd like to meet you in person," he said. "There's something we need to go over regarding the contractor invoice connected to your property." We met at a diner just off Route 5. Arlen was wiry, with the kind of posture that told you he'd spent a good part of his life in uniform. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a copy of the demolition invoice I'd already seen, but this one had something new. A handwritten note at the bottom, initialed by someone named Rivan. "You recognize that name?" Arlen asked. I nodded. "Stuart Rivan. He was on the board. He owns a landscaping company." Arlen leaned back. "That company's under investigation. Not for the landscaping, though. We believe he's been laundering HOA funds through a series of fake maintenance contracts, dating back at least a year." He pulled out another document, a spreadsheet showing a dozen payments labeled irrigation repair and erosion control, totaling nearly $42,000. "None of those repairs were ever made," he said. "We've confirmed with drone inspections and resident statements. Your case with the barn is what triggered the deeper inquiry." I let that sink in. It hadn't just been about enforcing aesthetics or pushing people around. These folks were stealing from their neighbors. "Is it enough to charge him?" I asked. Arlen gave a slow nod. "It's enough to indict the whole board." That night I got a knock on my door. It was Mrs. Callahan. Her husband stood behind her, arms crossed. She looked nervous. "Can we talk inside?" she asked. Once seated, she opened a manila envelope and laid out several pages of printed emails. All of them were between her and Lori Chen, the third board member. The messages showed Lori had threatened escalating fines unless the Callahans agreed to lease a portion of their backyard to the HOA for utility access. But there were no utilities involved. They'd refused, and the fines had started arriving a week later. "Did you ever sign anything?" I asked. "No," Mrs. Callahan said, "but we think she forged a document. We found a notice posted on the community board claiming we'd agreed to the lease." I took photos of everything. The next morning, I handed them off to Arlen. He took one glance and said, "Forgery's a separate count." That's felony territory. By the end of that week, the county issued formal arrest warrants for Rivan, Chen, and Margene. Early Friday morning, unmarked cars rolled into Heritage Hills. Word spread fast. I stood on my porch and watched as each of them was escorted out in cuffs. Rivan tried to hide his face behind a hoodie. Lori Chen kept her head down. Margene, though she met the crowd's gaze, her expression unreadable. The charges were announced that afternoon: embezzlement, mail fraud, falsification of public documents, criminal conspiracy, and in Margene's case, solicitation of unlawful demolition. The news spread like wildfire. Local outlets ran segments calling it the largest HOA corruption case in county history. People who'd never spoken to each other before were now gathered on sidewalks, comparing experiences, shaking their heads. That weekend, I hosted a neighborhood meeting in the barn. It was standing room only. A woman named Dana, who lived 2 streets over, stood up holding a ledger. "I used to be a forensic bookkeeper," she said. "If we're rebuilding this HOA, I want transparency. I volunteer to audit every transaction going forward." Another man, Keith, a retired contractor, offered to form a maintenance committee with actual work logs and resident oversight. People clapped. Some even cheered. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a team. But the fallout wasn't over yet. The interim administrator appointed by the court, a no-nonsense woman named Ingrid Mallory, held a special session the following Thursday. She revealed the HOA had taken out a line of credit the previous year without informing residents. The money, almost $60,000, had been funneled into beautification projects that never happened. The loan was still on the books. "We've contacted the lending institution," she said. "And we're working with the city to have the debt declared fraudulent." She paused, then looked out over the crowd gathered in the community center. "In the meantime," she continued, "the HOA will not be collecting dues. All payments are suspended until a full forensic audit is complete and court approval is given for future operations." A murmur went through the crowd. For some folks, that meant real financial breathing room. For others, it was validation. Over the next few weeks, as the barn continued to serve as our ad hoc town hall, we rebuilt. We drafted new bylaws, ones that required open meetings, term limits, and mandatory public budgets. We held our first official election under state observation. Dana was elected treasurer. Keith took over maintenance. I was chosen as a member at large, mostly to liaise with the city and keep the community updated on the ongoing legal case, and it wasn't over. During the pre-trial hearings, the DA's office revealed that Margene had personally signed off on a plan to annex a strip of undeveloped land behind 6 homes, including mine. The goal: to convert it into a community green belt, which would have allowed the HOA to collect additional assessments and raise dues without a single vote from the homeowners. They'd even submitted a forged survey map to the county zoning office. That added conspiracy to commit fraud to the existing charges. The judge didn't hesitate to deny bail for any of them. Meanwhile, the city council, spurred by our case, began reviewing HOA oversight laws. I was invited to speak at one of their sessions. I told them everything from the bulldozer to the forged documents to the culture of fear that had ruled our neighborhood. One of the council members, a former attorney, leaned forward and said, "This kind of abuse thrives in the dark. We're going to make sure it never gets that dark again." By the time spring rolled around, the barn had new shingles, courtesy of a weekend work party led by Keith and half a dozen teenagers from the neighborhood. Someone painted a mural on the side, bright colors and bold letters that read, "Built to last." The trials began in April. They were public, televised, and brutal. Rivan tried to shift blame, claiming he'd only followed instructions. Chen attempted to plead diminished responsibility, citing stress and medication. Margene, she represented herself for the first hearing, then requested a public defender after the court warned her she was in over her head. The jury didn't take long. All 3 were convicted on multiple counts. Margene got 5 years. Rivan, 4, Lori Chen, 3 with probation. Each was ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and, in Margene's case, directly to me for the attempted demolition. That final check arrived in early May. I framed the stub and hung it in the barn, not because of the money, but because it was proof. Proof that even when people in power try to bury the truth sometimes, all it takes is one stubborn barn to bring them down. 2 days after the verdicts were handed down, I got a call from Ingrid Mallory, the court-appointed administrator who'd been overseeing the transition of power in the HOA. She asked if I could stop by the community center that afternoon. There was something I needed to see. When I arrived, she was already there, standing by a long, folding table laid out with a dozen sealed banker's boxes. She motioned to one of them. These were recovered from a storage unit rented under the HOA's name. The unit was paid for through the HOA's operating account, but it was never disclosed in any financial report. The city ordered the contents turned over. She handed me a pair of gloves and opened the first box. Inside were files. Thick manila folders labeled with addresses from the neighborhood. Some had red tabs. Others had annotations in looping, slanted handwriting. She pulled out one marked Priority Vaughn Nettle. My stomach turned. Inside were aerial photos of my property taken from multiple angles. High resolution, printed on glossy paper with measurements drawn in red pen. Attached to the back was a typed document detailing a proposed land repurposing initiative, complete with a projection of value increase if the barn were removed and the space converted into shared green space. "Someone spent real money on this," Ingrid said quietly. This wasn't just an overreach. This was targeted. I flipped through more pages. There were legal drafts unsigned but detailed of proposed easement claims that would have allowed the HOA to seize partial control of backyards running along the east side of the neighborhood, mine included. "They were preparing to manufacture consent," I said. Ingrid nodded. And that wasn't all. She opened another box. This one had a laptop sealed in an evidence bag, next to it a stack of printed emails, at the top, a message from Margene to Riven. The subject line read, Phase 2. The email was short but chilling. If Vaughn doesn't back down, we'll proceed with the alternate plan. Stewart says the contractor can start work at night if needed. I'll handle the paperwork later. Just make sure the council doesn't catch wind. I looked up at Ingrid. They were planning to do it behind my back, at night. She nodded grimly. The city's handed this over to the district prosecutor. It's now part of a broader investigation. The next morning, I was asked to testify before a grand jury. Not for the prior charges, those had already been decided, but for a new round of indictments. This time, the charges included conspiracy to commit fraud against multiple residents, attempted illegal seizure of private property, and unauthorized surveillance. The surveillance angle came from a separate discovery. An HOA-funded drone, registered under a shell company, had been flying over residents' homes without notice or consent. The pilot was traced back to an intern Margene had hired the previous summer. When the grand jury handed down new indictments, they didn't stop at the original 3. 2 more former board members, including a man who'd quietly resigned a year earlier, were swept up in the charges. They'd known, and they'd helped hide it. Meanwhile, cleanup from the damage they'd left behind was still ongoing. The city had assigned a liaison to help the neighborhood navigate the aftermath. Her name was Lee Ransom, and she moved quickly. Within 3 weeks, she helped us draft a new charter, one that stripped the HOA of all enforcement powers unless ratified by a 2/3 majority at a public meeting. She also helped us secure a grant to cover legal costs and repair work around the neighborhood. One morning, while I was replanting a line of hedges that had been torn up by the bulldozer's tires, Lee walked up the drive holding a thick envelope. "This came from the zoning board," she said. "You'll want to see it." Inside was a formal acknowledgement from the county. The barn was now recognized as a historical structure. I hadn't applied for it, but someone had submitted the paperwork on my behalf, complete with blueprints, a history of construction, and photos of my grandfather building it. I stared at the final page. It was signed by Mrs. Callahan. She said it was the least she could do, Lee said. "You saved this place." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded and carefully tucked the papers under my arm. Weeks passed. Spring turned to early summer. The trials for the new round of charges were scheduled for the fall, but the DA's office had already confirmed that plea deals were unlikely. With the mountain of new evidence, especially the drone surveillance and the attempted late-night demolition plan, the prosecution had the upper hand. One afternoon, I stopped by the barn to drop off some folding chairs. A group of kids were inside, gathered around an old workbench. One of them had turned into a model train station. Keith had wired up a switch to power the tracks, and the trains ran in a perfect loop. A woman I hadn't met before approached me from the open doors. She introduced herself as Sandra, said she just bought the house at the corner of Briar Lane and Poplar Drive. "I heard about what happened," she said. "My realtor told me the whole story, said the barn used to be a battleground." "Not anymore," I said. She smiled. "Glad to hear it. You mind if I host a garden club meeting here next week? We don't have enough space inside my place." "Barn's open," I said. "Always." As she walked off, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time: people laughing freely in their yards. Dogs ran off leash through the common green. A group of teens were helping Keith patch the fence behind the community center without being asked. The fear was gone. A month later, I received a letter from the state attorney general's office. They were launching a statewide HOA review initiative, using our case as the foundation. The letter thanked me for my cooperation and said that new legislation was being introduced to require third-party audits for any HOA handling more than $50,000 annually. I framed that letter too. Hung it right next to the check Margene had been ordered to write. The final court date came in late August. All 5 former board members were sentenced. Longer terms this time, fewer loopholes. They were ordered to pay restitution to every resident who had been fined, harassed, or surveilled without cause. As part of their sentencing, they were also barred from serving on any HOA board in the state for life. I didn't attend that hearing. I didn't need to. Instead, I spent that morning repainting the barn's east-facing wall. The mural had faded a bit in the heat. I traced the letters with fresh color, made sure the lines were straight. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at the words, "Built to last." And now it was.